Hey guys, tonight we are not exactly heading somewhere cozy. Instead, you find yourself standing on the frozen lip of a fjord, the air so sharp it feels like glass sliding into your lungs. The snow crunches beneath your boots with that hollow, squeaky sound that only happens when the world is colder than any sane person would choose. Your breath fogs up instantly, rising like a tiny gray cloud that drifts and disappears into the endless black sky. The stars above look sharper than they ever do in the city, as if someone has taken sandpaper to the heavens. The Viking world stretches around you, and it's about 40 below, give or take a few degrees. You can feel your eyelashes start to freeze together. Honestly, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you don't mind, drop a comment telling me your location and what time it is right now. It's always fun to see where people are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fjord lies still, ice hugging the shoreline like a stubborn guest who won't leave. You trudge forward, boots slipping slightly on packed snow. The wind pushes against your face with such confidence that you feel like it has a personal vendetta against you. In the distance, a Viking longhouse crouches low against the elements, its roof sagging under heavy drifts. You head toward it, hoping the promise of fire and company will be more than just legend. The closer you get, the more you realize that warmth is relative. The first thing you notice about stepping onto Viking ground is how quiet it is. Modern winters are never truly silent. There's always the faint hum of a car engine, the buzzing of a far-off street lamp, or some neighbor who refuses to stop shoveling at 2 a.m. But here, the quiet is so thick it wraps around you like another layer of fur. Every crunch of your footstep feels intrusive, like you've broken some kind of ancient agreement to tread lightly. You imagine the Vikings hearing this same silence centuries ago, broken only by the snap of firewood or the howl of a wolf somewhere far beyond the trees. Your fingers, stuffed inside wool mittens, already feel clumsy. The wool itches slightly, but it's better than nothing. Historians will tell you Vikings were masters of layering clothes, linen underneath, wool on top, and fur wherever they could manage. But right now, you're thinking less about historical context and more about how you'd sell your phone charger just to have a heated blanket. You pull your cloak tighter, pretending it makes a difference. The longhouse finally looms before you, walls built from timber that looks rough but sturdy. Snow clings to the roof, occasionally sliding off in powdery sheets when the wind decides to rearrange the world. You duck inside, and the first blast of air you meet isn't warm, it's smoky. The fire in the center of the hall smolders with more stubbornness than efficiency. Heat doesn't so much rush to greet you as it sulks in the middle of the room, unwilling to share. You sidle closer, trying to pretend you're blending in with the rest of the crowd gathered around the flames. Inside, the longhouse is dim. A few oil lamps flicker here and there, their light catching on carved wooden beams and rough-hewn benches. The smell of smoke mixes with something vaguely edible, maybe porridge, maybe fish, maybe both. You can't be sure. Vikings didn't have the luxury of open kitchen concepts or ventilation systems. Their idea of good design was simple: 4 walls that don't collapse and a fire that doesn't go out. The smoke swirls lazily, staining the air, clinging to your hair and cloak until you smell like you've been marinated in it. A Viking family huddles near the fire. Children peek out from under wool blankets, their cheeks red and shiny from the cold. An older man stirs a pot suspended above the flames, and you can almost hear him muttering about how much better the soup would taste if someone had managed to hunt a deer. You realize quickly that survival here is not glamorous. It's less epic warrior saga and more please, let's not freeze to death before morning. And here where the historians start to disagree. Some say the longhouses were marvels of insulation for their time, with thick turf walls that held in the heat surprisingly well. Others argue that no matter how clever the design, the sheer brutality of Scandinavian winters meant everyone was still perpetually cold. You tend to side with the second camp, mostly because your toes are currently staging a mutiny inside your boots. One curious detail: archaeologists have found that many Viking houses had benches running along the walls, not just for sitting, but for sleeping. Imagine spending your night on a long wooden bench, maybe softened by some straw and a thin blanket, while smoke from the fire curls overhead and occasionally drops sparks near your head. Cozy, right? Except not really. You shuffle toward one of these benches, testing the wood with your hand. It's solid, but you can already tell your back will complain. Modern mattresses would be considered sorcery here. You settle in anyway, your cloak wrapped tight, the fire flickering in your peripheral vision. Around you, murmured voices rise and fall, like waves on a dark sea. A woman hums softly while darning a wool sock, the needle flashing briefly in the firelight. Somewhere near the door, a dog stirs, shakes itself, and lies back down with a sigh so dramatic it feels almost human. These little moments anchor you. The Vikings may have had sagas full of gods, giants, and dragon ships, but the everyday reality was much quieter. Waiting out the cold, making do with what they had, and hoping spring would come before their food ran out. You think about the fjord outside, frozen and glistening under starlight. The water would have been a lifeline in warmer months, carrying ships heavy with trade goods and warriors. Now, it's just a flat, icy expanse that looks deceptively calm. People in the longhouse probably remember summer fondly, rowing, fishing, maybe even raiding if the mood and politics allowed. But winter is a different saga altogether. Here, survival is less about conquering distant lands and more about managing to keep the firewood dry. The crackle of the fire grows louder for a moment, sparks leaping up like tiny dancers before fading into the smoke. You shift closer, basking in that fragile warmth. Someone tosses a log onto the flames, and the fire answers with a hiss and a pop. You can almost imagine it speaking, saying, "Fine, I'll keep going, but don't expect miracles." Fire was the heart of Viking survival, and without it, even the most rugged warrior would have been reduced to an icicle with a beard. A little boy catches your eye, peering out from under his blanket. He looks at you as if wondering whether you'll freeze solid before morning. You smile faintly, though your lips feel stiff from the cold. He giggles, then disappears back into his cocoon. For a moment, you're reminded that Viking life wasn't just about axes and ships. It was also about raising families, finding small joys in long winters, and hoping kids didn't grow up thinking smoke-filled longhouses were normal. Historians often argue whether winters brought communities closer or pushed them into quiet misery. Some say the long, dark nights fostered storytelling, with sagas passed from mouth to mouth like treasured heirlooms. Others suggest people were too busy coughing from smoke inhalation and worrying about frostbite to wax poetic about Odin. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Right now, listening to the low murmur of conversation, you suspect both were true. Laughter on some nights, silent endurance on others. You lean back against the wall, feeling the rough timber press into your shoulders. The wind rattles outside, tugging at the roof like an impatient child. Inside, though, the hall holds steady. You're alive for now, thanks to fire, wool, and stubborn human determination. Your mind drifts to how different life would be if you had to rely solely on what you could chop, hunt, or stitch together. No thermostat, no hot water bottle, just your own grit, and a community of people who share the same goal. Make it through another night. The fire pops again, and someone laughs softly at a joke you don't catch. You realize that this is how you stay alive here. Layers of clothing, layers of community, layers of stubbornness against the cold. You close your eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the flames pretend it's enough. The night is far from over, but at least you've made it this far. The fire hums low, crackling like it knows it's your only friend right now. But eventually, you have to get up, stretch your stiff back, and shuffle around the hall. The warmth clings only to the center, and the benches along the walls are still cold enough to make your bones ache. You start to understand why the Vikings treated clothing not as fashion, but as straight-up survival gear. You pull your cloak tighter, but even that feels like a thin promise against the icy night waiting just beyond the door. Layers, that's the whole secret. The Vikings lived in layers, not delicate, minimalist, Scandinavian design Instagram layers, but real, practical, itchy, slightly smelly ones. First came linen, the base layer. You imagine slipping into a linen tunic, not because it's soft, it's actually kind of scratchy, but because it keeps sweat off your skin. Then wool. Lots and lots of wool. If you thought your grandma's knitted sweaters were a bit much, you should try stepping into a Viking longhouse and seeing entire families wrapped like woolen burritos. Over that, furs, pelts, sometimes leather, sometimes even feathers tucked into seams if things were desperate. You don't think about looking cute. You think about not dying. As you shuffle closer to one of the benches, you brush past a young man untangling skeins of dyed wool. He looks up with a grin that says, yes, he knows his clothes don't smell great, but at least he's warm. You can practically hear his inner monologue, better itchy than frozen solid. He adjusts a cloak clasped with a simple bronze brooch, the kind archaeologists find all the time in burial sites. It's heavy and practical, pinning thick cloth in place against wind that would otherwise peel it away. You think about how in our world we use zippers and Velcro, but here it's just metal pins and leather ties. Surprisingly effective. Your hands trace the edge of your own cloak, pretending it's wolf fur, even though it feels more like bargain bin sheepskin. The idea is the same. Vikings wore animal pelts not only for warmth, but also for the symbolism. A wolf skin draped across your shoulders wasn't just insulation. It was identity, power, even a warning to anyone thinking of messing with you. Though honestly, you'd take polyester insulation over symbolism any day. The funny thing is, Vikings actually cared about looking decent under all those layers. Archaeologists find combs in graves all the time, combs carved from bone, antler, even walrus tusk. Imagine it. You're living in minus 40 degrees, your breath freezing on your beard, but you still pause to comb your hair. Priorities. Historians still argue whether this was vanity or just a practical way to keep lice in check. Either way, you realize that hygiene wasn't totally absent. You smile to yourself, picture a warrior carefully brushing his hair before stepping into a hall full of smoke and sweat. The world changes, but people don't. Sit back on the bench and pull your cloak around your knees. The fabric smells faintly of lanolin, that sheepy, waxy scent that clings forever. Wool has this miraculous quality of keeping you warm even when damp, which in a snow and ice landscape was as close to magic as mortals were going to get. You rub the fabric between your fingers, feeling the coarse fibers scratch, and suddenly you understand why Vikings valued sheep so highly. Not just for food, but for endless spinning, weaving, and layering. Someone beside you adjusts a hood that looks suspiciously like it's made from rabbit fur. You suppress a laugh. It looks like the medieval version of a beanie. Functional, slightly goofy, but essential. You imagine trudging outside into a night where your breath freezes before you finish exhaling. And you know that rabbit fur hood is probably the difference between frostbite and just another uncomfortable evening. The conversation around the fire drifts toward clothing repairs. A woman holds up a pair of woolen hose, Viking leg coverings that look like socks, but go all the way up. She's darning a hole near the knee, muttering about how snow seems to eat through fabric faster than it should. You realize that repairing clothes was a never-ending cycle. Wear, patch, wear again, patch again. Nothing was disposable. Every thread mattered. You can almost hear a Viking father lecturing his children. Don't tear your tunic. We don't have another. Kids probably rolled their eyes then just like they do now, though back then ripping your tunic meant an actual risk of freezing. You glance down at your own boots. Thick, fur-lined, wrapped with straps. They pinch a little, but you take pinching over numb toes. Vikings crafted footwear with thick leather soles and fur uppers tied snug around the ankles. Some even stuffed grass inside their shoes for insulation. Yes, grass. Dry, crinkly grass. The medieval version of thermal socks. The idea makes you smile. You picture someone saying, "Hold on, let me just stuff some lawn clippings in my boots before we go." You lean forward, elbows on your knees, staring at the fire. Your cloak slides slightly, and you tug it back up, realizing again how essential every layer feels. The hall itself offers little warmth. It's your clothes that do the heavy lifting. Without them, the fire is just a small reprieve in an ocean of cold. You think about how easy it is to complain about a sweater being too scratchy in modern life, and you want to laugh. If you were here, you'd kiss the feet of whoever knitted that scratchy monstrosity. The truth is, clothing was armor against winter, just as much as against swords. And while you might imagine Vikings swaggering around in battle gear all the time, the reality is that most of the year, most of them were just trying not to freeze. You picture a warrior waking up, layering linen, wool, fur, tugging on boots stuffed with grass, and only then strapping on an axe. Fashion shows weren't a thing. Staying alive was the runway. Historians debate how colorful Viking clothes really were. Popular imagination paints them in gray and brown, but evidence suggests they loved dyes, reds, blues, yellows made from plants, minerals, even imported materials. You imagine trudging into the longhouse on a dark winter night and seeing someone swish past in a surprisingly bright red cloak. Against all this brown wood and smoke, that splash of color must have been dazzling. Maybe it cheered people up. Maybe it was status. Maybe it was both. You picture the whispers. "Oh, he's wearing madder dye fancy." Humans have always found ways to flex. Stretch your legs, feeling the stiffness in your knees. Around you, the people continue to shuffle, wrap, unwrap, rewrap. Clothes weren't static here. They were adjusted constantly, added, removed, layered differently depending on whether you were inside or braving the wind. You realize how tiring it must have been just to keep comfortable. A constant battle with the elements that never ended. Yet, in its own way, it feels peaceful. Everyone focused on the same task, keeping the warmth in, keeping the cold out. You imagine stepping outside again, pulling your cloak hood over your head, snow crunching beneath your boots, the layers pressing in around you like a soft fortress. The stars would still glare down, the wind still bite, but at least you'd know the wool, fur, and linen are holding the line. It's strange comfort, the kind that only comes when survival itself feels like a small, steady victory. The fire pops again, and you find yourself hypnotized by the glow. The flames bend and curl like ribbons, sending sparks spiraling upward into the smoky air before they vanish into the rafters. The longhouse creaks a little as the wind pushes against it, but inside, you feel cocooned. You settle deeper on the bench, cloak tucked around you, and realize that no matter how many layers of wool and fur you've got, there's nothing like fire to make survival feel less impossible. It's not just heat, it's light, sound, company. Without fire, the longhouse would be pitch black, and you'd be bumping into benches and muttering curses in the dark. With fire, shadows flicker on the walls like half-forgotten memories. Someone tosses another log onto the flames, and the whole hall sighs, a collective relief that this small sun in the center still burns. You think of modern heating systems, invisible and efficient, and you almost laugh. Here, the fire doesn't just keep you warm, it commands your life. You edge closer, stretching your palms toward the flames until your skin tingles. The warmth is uneven, like standing next to a space heater that only half cares about you. Your front roasts, your back freezes. You do a slow shuffle turn, like a rotisserie chicken, hoping to even things out. It's awkward, but effective. You imagine the Vikings doing the same dance, silently rotating like sleepy planets around their hearth. The smoke clings, of course. It curls into your nose, your hair, your clothes. You cough once, then settle into it, because there's no other choice. Archaeologists have found evidence of soot buildup on Viking rafters thick enough to suggest decades of fires burning almost nonstop. Imagine living inside a chimney, and you've got the idea. Scholars argue whether longhouses had holes in the roof for ventilation, or if the smoke just seeped out slowly through thatch. Either way, your lungs are not thrilled. You picture waking up with eyes watering, throat raw, and thinking, "Ah, good morning. Another day in paradise." A man near the fire adjusts the pot hanging over the flames. The soup inside bubbles sluggishly, sending up steam that briefly cuts through the smoke. The smell is questionable. Something like fish, something like porridge, maybe both. Your stomach grumbles anyway. Heat and food, two things that make the longhouse livable. Without them, you'd be huddled outside, gnawing on frozen snow. You lean forward as if closer proximity might improve the flavor. But the truth is, Viking cooking was less about gourmet taste and more about not starving. Still, you find it oddly comforting. The fire isn't just for warmth. It's a kitchen, a light source, a spiritual anchor. In the sagas, fire is often tied to hospitality. A guest is always offered a place by the fire first, before food or drink. You feel that tradition now as you sit among strangers who nod politely, as if to say, "Yes, you too may share this warmth." The flames crackle louder for a moment, a log collapsing inward. You realize how much effort it must have taken just to keep fuel on hand. Gathering wood in the middle of winter is not a quick errand. It's trudging through snowdrifts, chopping frozen logs, dragging them back. Firewood was survival currency, and you imagine families rationing it carefully, deciding whether to add another log or just huddle closer instead. There's a debate, of course, among historians. Some argue longhouses could hold heat so well that once the fire warmed the room, it lingered for hours. Others insist the drafty design meant you were always cold unless the fire blazed constantly. Judging by the chill creeping into your boots, you're inclined to believe the latter. You scoot even closer until you can feel your eyebrows singeing slightly. A small price to pay. Children cluster near the flames, their cheeks flushed pink. They play a quiet game with sticks, poking the edge of the fire until their mother scolds them with a sharp word. You smile. Some things never change. Kids will always want to play with the one dangerous thing in the room. The boy sulks, pulls his blanket tighter, and settles back down, glaring at the fire as though it betrayed him personally. You close your eyes for a moment, just listening. The fire crackles, the soup bubbles, someone shifts on a wooden bench. It's not silent, but it's steady. You understand why fire must have felt alive to them, a kind of companion through the endless dark. Without clocks, without electricity, fire marked the rhythm of their nights. It burned down, was fed again, burned back up. A living heartbeat in the middle of the hall. You think about how fragile it is. A storm strong enough could put it out. A careless hand could scatter embers. That thought makes you uneasy. If the fire dies, you all die a little faster. It explains why the hearth was sacred, why tending it was a task that carried real weight. You imagine someone waking every hour, checking, feeding, making sure the glow never disappeared. As you stretch your legs toward the flames, you notice a detail. The stones circling the fire pit are cracked, darkened, clearly used for years. They've soaked up smoke and heat, bearing the marks of countless winters. You wonder how many people sat here before you, turning like chickens, sighing in relief, mumbling complaints about smoke. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The fire ties them all together across time. Someone pulls out a drinking horn, fills it with something steaming, and hands it around. You accept it with numb fingers, raising it to your lips. The liquid scalds your tongue, but you don't care. It's warm, probably mead or weak ale, maybe with herbs. Vikings weren't drinking pumpkin spice lattes, but they did know that hot liquid could keep spirits up. You take another sip, coughing slightly as it goes down. It burns in the best way. The fire flickers, throwing light on the carved wooden posts supporting the roof. You see runes etched into the beams, faint but still there, scratched by hands long ago. Protection, blessing, luck, marks meant to keep the fire strong, the house safe. You trace one absent-mindedly, the grooves shallow but deliberate. You wonder if the person who carved it believed it would truly help, or if it was just tradition, habit, comfort. Historians still argue about whether such carvings were deeply spiritual or just cultural decoration. You decide it doesn't matter. Either way, they remind you that survival was never just physical. It was mental too. A sense that you weren't completely alone in the dark. The fire snaps loudly, startling you. A tiny ember lands on your cloak, and you pat it away before it leaves a hole. You chuckle softly. Authentic Viking experience, you think, dodging sparks while trying not to cough yourself to death. But you also realize that despite the discomfort, there's something profoundly grounding here. Fire doesn't just keep you alive. It gives you something to watch, something to listen to, something to believe in when the night feels endless. You lean back, the warmth soaking into your bones. The air is still thick with smoke, your clothes heavy with the smell, but you feel steadier now. The fire has your back, at least for tonight. Outside, the world is frozen, silent, waiting. Inside, the flames dance, stubborn and bright. You sigh, pulling your cloak tighter, and let yourself sink into the rhythm of crackle, hiss, pop, the lullaby of survival. The night pushes on, heavy and endless, and eventually you realize that the fire, as steady as it is, cannot follow you everywhere. Outside the longhouse, the world is still a vast and merciless sheet of ice. At some point, you're going to have to leave the smoky warmth and face it. Your cloak feels thin again, just thinking about it. You shuffle toward the door, pulling the hood over your head, bracing yourself for the bite of the cold that always feels sharper after firelight. The door creaks open, and there it is again, that slap of air so frigid it feels personal, like the wind has been waiting for you all night. Snow drifts across the ground, sparkling faintly in the pale moonlight. Your boots sink a little, crunching down through layers of crust. The longhouse behind you glows dimly, its smoke curling up into the stars. Out here, you realize quickly, fire alone won't cut it. Sometimes, you have to build shelter from whatever the land begrudgingly offers. You trudge a little further, past the shadow of the longhouse, until the trees crowd closer. Pines bend under the weight of snow, branches sagging so low they almost sweep the ground. You imagine a Viking family trudging out here, dragging wood, turf, even bone if it came to that. They'd piece together a shelter where none seemed possible, turning the landscape itself into walls. You press your mittened hand against a mound of frozen earth and snow, trying to picture it transformed. Stone was the first option, heavy, immovable, unforgiving. Vikings stacked stones to form crude walls, packing the gaps with moss and mud. Not glamorous, but surprisingly effective at blocking wind. Bone, too. When stone wasn't available, whale ribs rising like a skeletal arch, covered in hides and snow. You pause, imagining sitting inside such a shelter, the bones creaking in storms, the whole thing smelling faintly of sea salt and decay. Not exactly your dream airbnb, but better than frostbite. Then there's turf, chunks of earth and grass sliced like cake, stacked thick to form walls. Turf houses were common in Iceland, where trees were scarce, and the ground itself became building material. You picture cutting the earth into neat, rectangular slabs, your hands numb, your breath freezing, as you pile them up into a wall. Heavy, damp, but insulating. You step back in your imagination, admiring your mossy little fortress, and chuckle. The Vikings might not have invented central heating, but they did invent the world's coldest mud hut chic. Of course, snow itself could be a shelter. You remember stories of Inuit igloos and realize the Vikings must have understood something similar. Snow, when piled and shaped properly, traps air and holds warmth. You brush your mitten across a drift, considering. Dig into it, carve out a hollow, cover the entrance, and suddenly you have a cocoon warmer than the open night. You picture yourself crawling inside, listening to the muffled silence, the snow glowing faintly as moonlight filters through. Cozy, if claustrophobic. Historians still argue over how often Vikings relied on makeshift shelters versus permanent longhouses. Some believe temporary shelters were only for travel, hunting trips, or emergencies. Others think they were more common than we realize, especially during harsh winters when people needed to spread out. Standing here in the cold, you suspect the truth is somewhere in between. If your choice is between building a turf hut and freezing, you're grabbing a spade. You try to imagine the process. First, gather driftwood along the coast, gnarled, salt-worn logs carried by the sea. Then bones from a whale carcass, maybe even antlers from elk. Pile turf or snow over the frame, secure it with whatever rope or sinew you have, and pray it doesn't collapse mid-blizzard. Not exactly glamorous construction work, but effective. You picture yourself inside, huddled around a tiny fire, walls dripping slightly from the heat, but alive. Always alive. You glance back toward the longhouse, its roof still covered in snow, and realize how clever the design really was. Steep pitch, so the weight slid off instead of caving in. Thick beams braced against storms. Entrances kept small, just big enough to crawl through, to keep precious warmth from escaping. Inside, the benches lined against the walls doubled as beds, storage, even hiding spots for smaller livestock. The entire building was less a house and more a survival capsule. A gust of wind cuts through your cloak, and you hunch your shoulders. You think about how often the Vikings must have checked their walls, their roofs, their firewood piles. Winter turned everyone into an amateur engineer. If a roof sagged, you propped it. If a wall cracked, you patched it with whatever you had. You didn't wait until spring. Spring might never come. You pause by a snowbank, squat down, and scoop some in your mitten. The flakes glisten under the moonlight, powdery and soft. You press it together into a crude block, imagining stacking hundreds of these to form a shelter. Your hands ache at the thought. You toss the block aside, chuckling at yourself. Romantic in theory, exhausting in reality. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of pretending. They simply did it over and over until survival became habit. You step back toward the longhouse, boots crunching steadily. Your imagination lingers, though, on all those shelters, the turf walls smelling of damp earth, the bone arches echoing with sea storms, the snow caves glowing faintly from moonlight, the longhouse itself creaking against the wind. Each one a strategy, a stubborn refusal to freeze. A funny thought crosses your mind. Today, people brag about tiny homes and ecologes. The Vikings would laugh. They were already living the ultimate off-grid lifestyle, not because it was trendy, but because it was the only option. Their shelters were efficient, sustainable, and designed to keep a family alive when the world outside wanted them gone. You pull your cloak tighter, the smoke from the longhouse fire reaching you faintly, and you realize something. Shelter, in the Viking world, wasn't just protection from the elements. It was proof. Proof that you'd worked, planned, adapted. Proof that you had the grit to carve a space where none was offered. Proof that, at least for one more night, you belonged in this brutal, frozen world. You duck back into the longhouse, the smoky warmth hitting you like a wall. For a moment, you just stand there, letting your fingers thaw. The benches, the fire, the chatter, it all feels more precious now that you've been reminded of the other options. You sit again, cloak still cold from outside, and watch the flames. The walls may be rough, the roof heavy with snow, but right now, this place is a fortress. A fragile, smoky, stubborn fortress. And in a winter like this, that's all you can ask for. You shove another armful of damp, frozen wood into the fire pit, muttering under your breath at how stubbornly it refuses to catch. Every puff of smoke seems to curl back into your face, making your eyes water and sting in the freezing air. Your mittens are stiff with frost. Your breath comes out in little clouds that crystallize instantly, and your toes are trying their best impression of 2 blocks of ice rattling around in your boots. At this point, you might be thinking that a little central heating wouldn't go amiss, or at least an electric blanket. Too bad those are about 9 centuries and several awkward inventions away. Instead, you're stuck here in the Viking Age, where survival is more about knowing how to outwit winter than about turning a dial on the thermostat. You shuffle a little closer to the smoldering wood and poke at it with a stick, grumbling like an amateur pyromaniac. Fire is life here, and not just in the its cozy sense. Without a decent blaze, your food doesn't cook, your water doesn't boil, and your frostbitten hands don't thaw. You can imagine the sagas written about you later. And then there was that traveler who froze to death because he couldn't figure out the difference between kindling and kind of wet logs. Not exactly heroic. That's why the Vikings didn't just stumble into winter blind. They built their entire lives around anticipating the chill. As your fire finally sputters into a reluctant flame, you realize that warmth isn't just about flames licking at logs. It's also about the clever layering of bodies, materials, and spaces. You glance down at your tunic, wool, scratchy, but surprisingly effective. Wool is basically nature's cheat code. It traps air, keeps you warm even when wet, and doesn't complain when you've worn it for, maybe 30 days in a row. Historians still argue whether Vikings considered hygiene optional or just a spring activity. But the clothes weren't about fashion, they were about survival. They wore under tunics, over tunics, trousers, socks, leg wraps, cloaks, and sometimes animal pelts. You're lucky if you can wrap your scarf without accidentally strangling yourself. But layering wasn't only about wool and fur. There's another heat source that works like magic, if a little uncomfortably: people. Yes, the Vikings were no strangers to the art of communal living. Forget personal space. Huddling together under shared blankets and pelts was both practical and expected. You imagine lying shoulder to shoulder with an entire family on a raised wooden platform, smoke drifting above your heads from the central hearth, someone's snores rattling the rafters, and the occasional goat bleating nearby. Cozy, sort of romantic. Only if you consider frostbitten toes pressing against your shin in the dead of night a love language. You cough as another gust of smoke hits your face, and your eyes wander to the dark rafters above you. Their heavy beams, dripping with soot from years of indoor fires. Viking longhouses weren't exactly equipped with modern chimneys. Smoke gathered in the room, creeping up until it seeped through gaps in the roof, and while it stung your eyes, it also preserved meat hung in the rafters. Congratulations, your lungs might hate you, but your dinner won't rot. Practical trade-off, really. Scholars still debate just how well ventilated these longhouses, or whether the smoke actually escaped effectively, or whether everyone just grew up with permanent watery eyes and chronic coughs. Either way, you're not alone in your suffering tonight. The fire pops, and you jump a little, muttering something about how this is supposed to be relaxing. And yet, there's a strange rhythm to it. You imagine the longhouse full of quiet sounds, the crackle of flames, the rustle of wool cloaks shifting, the faint drip of snow melting at the entrance, and the slow, steady breathing of tired farmers and warriors alike. You can almost smell the combination of wood smoke, dried fish, and damp wool that would hang heavy in the air. It isn't glamorous, but it is survivable. You wrap your cloak tighter and shuffle back from the fire, trying to avoid smelling like a smoked ham for the rest of your imaginary Viking career. It's funny, fires weren't just for heat or cooking. They were also little social magnets. Everyone gathered around them to tell stories, pass around cups of mead, or argue about whose ox was stronger. You can picture yourself nodding along drowsily as someone recounts an endless saga about a warrior who slew 3 giants, only to realize that most people probably made up half the details for entertainment. After all, how else do you pass the long, dark nights when daylight barely lasts a few hours? Still, even with fire, cloaks, and body heat, sometimes it wasn't enough. So, the Vikings turned to architecture. The longhouse was the ultimate winter survival chamber, cleverly designed to maximize heat and minimize drafts. Thick turf walls, often reinforced with wood, created insulation far better than your modern tent could dream of. The roof was steep to shed snow, but low enough to trap warmth. The sleeping platforms were raised to keep you off the cold, damp ground, and the entrance was often low and narrow, forcing you to stoop as you came in, practical for keeping warm air inside, though less practical for your spine. You hit your head on the beam every other time and wondered if concussions were just part of the Viking experience. You think about your own house for comparison. Double glazing, radiators, electric lights. You press a button and warmth spreads instantly. Here, warmth is a constant negotiation between man, material, and nature. Even your bedding matters. The Vikings used animal hides, furs, and woolen blankets to trap every ounce of body heat. Sometimes hay was stuffed under sleeping platforms for extra insulation, though if you were unlucky, that hay came with fleas included. You try not to think about that as you adjust your own cloak and mutter that itchy survival is still better than frozen death. Outside, the night howls. The wind tears across the landscape, rattling the wooden walls of your imagined longhouse. You picture the snow drifting knee-deep against the door, sealing you in for the night. Somewhere out there, wolves might be prowling, or just the occasional fox darting across the icy ground. It's you, the fire, and your fellow humans against the vast, indifferent cold. And strangely, you don't feel alone. The methods may seem primitive, but they work. They worked well enough that Norse communities thrived in climates that would send most modern vacationers running for the nearest heated spa. You poke at the fire again, more for comfort than necessity now. Each spark that leaps upward feels like a tiny rebellion against the night. And in those sparks, you glimpse why these people held fire as something more than physical. It was spiritual too, woven into myths and rituals. Loki, the trickster, was tied to fire in some traditions, and hearth fires were often treated with respect as symbols of home and continuity. If your fire went out, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was bad luck, a sign that something was amiss. You shiver a little, though you can't tell if it's from the draft or from the weight of all that symbolism pressing down on you. The flames calm, steady now, and your eyes grow heavy. The fire has done its job, not just in warming your bones, but in lulling your mind into that quiet, hypnotic state where the world outside doesn't matter so much anymore. Maybe tomorrow you'll worry about food or about trekking across icy rivers, but tonight you just sit here in the half-light, wrapped in layers of wool and smoke, listening to the winter whisper against the walls. And for the moment, you're alive. You wake up, if you can call it waking up, to a darkness that feels more like a physical weight pressing against your eyelids than just the absence of light. The fire in the hearth has collapsed into a low bed of embers, the faint orange glow barely stretching past the nearest log. The rest of the longhouse is swallowed in shadow. Your breath emerges as a pale cloud, immediately visible in the gloom, and you realize your nose is numb again. Even under all those layers of wool and fur, the cold has seeped in like a nosy neighbor who doesn't know when to leave. You shift slightly, the bedding crunching with frost in places where the hides have stiffened during the night. Somewhere to your left, a fellow villager lets out a snore that sounds suspiciously like a drowning goat. You're not sure if it's comforting or irritating, but it's noise, and noise means life. The reality is, Viking winters were long, unrelenting, and very, very dark. Nights could stretch on endlessly, and even when the sun rose, it wasn't exactly eager to hang around. For people without electricity, the fire was both literal and symbolic, a fragile island of warmth and safety against an ocean of ice and uncertainty. You can picture the hearth being carefully tended, one person waking every so often to toss in a piece of wood, making sure the flame never truly dies. Historians still argue whether certain households designated a specific person for night watch, or if everyone simply took turns. But either way, the message was clear: no fire, no survival. You shuffle closer to the embers, your hands instinctively reaching out even though they're already swaddled in mittens. The heat doesn't exactly roast your skin, it just kisses it politely, the way you might nod to an acquaintance you barely know. Your stomach growls, and you remember that dried fish jerky you tucked away under your blanket. It's hard as a rock and tastes vaguely like seawater met old leather, but you chew anyway. Food was never just food in these conditions, it was fuel. Each bite meant another chance to endure the next freezing hour. The longhouse creaks under the weight of snow piled on its roof, a sound so familiar you don't even flinch anymore. The beams above you hold firm, carved from sturdy timber. But you can't help imagining the moment when the snow decides to come crashing down all at once. Of course, the Vikings knew this too. That's why their longhouses were built low and strong, designed to withstand the push of wind and the crush of ice. They didn't care about cathedral-like ceilings or elegant arches. They cared about not being buried alive by the next storm. You shuffle deeper into your furs, muttering under your breath that maybe modern insulation isn't so bad after all. And then there's the silence. A silence so thick it hums in your ears. Occasionally, you hear the sharp crack of frost splitting wood outside, or the distant howl of something you'd rather not think about too much. Wolves, possibly. The odd, lonely fox, maybe. Your brain suggests it could also just be wind shrieking through a gap in the trees. But honestly, your imagination is better at making monsters than explanations at this hour. You smile faintly, remembering that scholars still argue about how superstitious Vikings truly were. Some say their lives were drenched in myth at every step. Others suggest they were more practical, relying on trial and error. Either way, at 2 a.m, with only glowing embers for company, the line between Odin's ravens and an ordinary crow starts to blur pretty quickly. Eventually, you give in to restlessness and crawl toward the doorway. The entrance is covered with a thick, stiff hide that crackles when you push it aside. A rush of night air immediately assaults your face, and for a second, you regret every decision you've ever made. But then the world opens up before you, and it's breathtaking. The snow glows faintly blue in the moonlight, each drift sculpted into strange, alien shapes by the wind. The trees stand tall and brittle, their branches frosted like sugar. Above it all, the sky dazzles with stars so sharp and clear you feel like you could reach up and pluck one right out of its frozen cradle. You stand there, your teeth chattering, and marvel at the northern lights unfurling in pale ribbons across the horizon. Historians still debate exactly what the Vikings thought about the aurora borealis. Some sources suggest they believed it was the armor of Valkyries catching the light, shimmering as they rode to collect the fallen. Others think it was simply one more wonder they didn't bother to explain. Because when you're already dealing with frostbite, explaining the sky feels like extra homework. Whatever they believed, it's easy to imagine that even the most hardened warrior would pause, humbled, at the sight of green fire dancing silently above their head. Your toes remind you that poetic stargazing doesn't actually keep you warm, so you shuffle back inside. The longhouse greets you with a thick wave of smoke and the faint stink of unwashed bodies. Privacy wasn't exactly a priority. In fact, you're lucky to have any space at all. A family's entire life, sleeping, cooking, mending, even certain other activities, took place in this one hall. Chickens and goats sometimes shared the floor too. Not because anyone particularly liked cuddling with livestock, but because animal body heat was free heating. Congratulations, you've just invented the medieval version of a space heater. You slide back into your bedding, but sleep still dances just out of reach. Your mind drifts instead to the morning, when you'll have to haul water again. Not from a tap, of course. Don't even dream about it. But from a hole hacked into the ice of a nearby stream. You picture yourself stumbling down there in the half-light, axe in hand, breaking through the crust, while your breath turns into a personal snowstorm around your face. The water is shockingly cold, so frigid it makes your teeth ache just to think about it. But it's life. No water, no porridge. No porridge, no energy. No energy, no chance of facing the day. And speaking of porridge, brace yourself. It's not the creamy cinnamon-sprinkled breakfast you're used to. Viking porridge was a utilitarian sludge of grains, sometimes flavored with a little dried fruit, or, if you're unlucky, salted fish. Historians still argue whether the consistency was closer to cement or wallpaper paste, but either way, it filled your belly and kept you moving. You grimace at the thought, and then laugh quietly, realizing that tomorrow morning you'll be thankful for every spoonful. Hunger has a way of lowering your culinary standards faster than any trendy diet. The long night stretches on. You roll to one side, then the other, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing all around you. Some snores are high-pitched, others rattle like loose cartwheels. It's a strange sort of orchestra, but it's reassuring. Each sound reminds you that you're not alone, that this fight against the cold isn't yours alone to bear. That's what made Viking communities strong, the collective effort. Alone, no one stood a chance. Together, with shared fires, shared food, and shared stories, survival became more than just possible. It became a way of life. Your eyes finally grow heavy, the embers blurring into soft shapes as you sink back into drowsiness. Somewhere in the haze between waking and dreaming, you picture yourself in the sagas, your deeds recorded in songs, your name whispered by storytellers long after the snow melts. Then you snort awake, realizing you've drooled on your sleeve. Not exactly heroic. But then again, the heroes of those tales probably drooled too. They just had better poets. You stomp through the snow that never seems to end. Every step a muffled crunch under layers of fur and leather. Your breath forming little clouds that drift away, as if they too would rather escape this cold. The village around you is little more than a handful of longhouses, their roofs sagging under heavy piles of snow, smoke curling from the holes cut into the tops. You're not really sure if the smoke is proof of warmth, or just proof that someone hasn't frozen solid yet. Tonight the sky stretches wide above you, a blanket of dark velvet pricked with stars, and you can almost convince yourself that the glittering northern lights are mocking you with their smug beauty. You would be in awe if your toes weren't busy staging a rebellion inside your boots. You duck through the heavy wooden doorway into the longhouse, and suddenly the world smells like smoke, sweat, and a faint whiff of stew that has probably been reheated 3 times this week. Inside, the atmosphere is almost comforting, though the fire crackling down the center barely takes the edge off. The Vikings knew this fact well. The longhouse wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. A roof over your head, shared warmth, and somewhere to collapse when your body finally surrenders to the cold. Historical accounts make it clear that families slept close together, often shoulder to shoulder on raised platforms lined with straw, blankets, and the occasional animal skin. It's not glamorous, but in this cold, personal space is a luxury you simply can't afford. You look down and realize you're wedged between a snoring fisherman and a goat that seems far too smug about its placement near the fire. You tell yourself you don't mind. Warmth is warmth, even if it comes with a faint smell of goat. Historians still argue whether livestock were consistently kept inside these homes for warmth, or if that was just a desperate measure during particularly harsh winters. Either way, you're pretty sure no one wrote ballads about the joys of sleeping next to a goat with questionable grooming habits. The air in here is thick, smoky, and oddly damp, like someone left a damp towel too close to a campfire. Yet, as your eyes adjust, you notice the way people have hung drying clothes and bundles of herbs from the rafters. The herbs weren't just for cooking. They doubled as a kind of medieval Febreze. Think juniper, birch, and other pungent plants meant to disguise the fact that 50 unwashed humans were crammed into the same room. You take a deep breath, only to immediately regret it when the goat sneezes. Still, the Viking longhouse wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the core of survival strategy. The long, narrow shape of the building made it easier to heat, with the hearth placed down the center and smoke venting upward through small roof holes. Of course, venting is generous. Most of that smoke simply lingered, coating the beams in soot and your lungs in what was probably an early form of chain smoking. Archaeologists say that the blackened timbers of excavated longhouses are proof of centuries of smoky fires. And you can't help but wonder how many people developed a cough that was as permanent as their sword scars. You shuffle closer to the fire, and someone hands you a chunk of bread so dense it could double as a weapon. This was a staple food, bread made from barley or rye, and if you didn't eat it, you could always use it to reinforce a wall. The stew bubbling in the cauldron smells vaguely like fish, though it's hard to tell if that's a good thing. Viking diets weren't luxurious, but they were practical: fish, dried meat, grains, and whatever root vegetables hadn't frozen into unrecognizable lumps. It's nourishing enough, though the flavor falls somewhere between earthy and please pass the salt. You chew slowly, partly because it's tough, and partly because your jaw feels numb from the cold. The fire crackles, sparks drifting upward before disappearing into the smoky gloom, and someone begins telling a story. You settle back, realizing that this was how people passed endless nights. Storytelling. You don't have Netflix, but you do have a skald with a voice so dramatic, it almost makes you forget your feet are ice cubes. The sagas were more than entertainment. They were how people remembered lineage, battles, and moral lessons. Tonight's tale is about a hero who slayed a monstrous serpent with nothing but a sword and sheer willpower. You want to raise your hand and ask whether the serpent might have just frozen to death instead. but you keep that thought to yourself. Sarcasm wasn't always welcome in a room full of warriors who measure respect by how loudly you can drink ale. Still, the stories help. The rhythm of the voice, the flickering of the fire, the way shadows dance on the beams, it all starts to lull you into that half-dream state where you're still listening, but also imagining yourself as the hero. You could do it, you tell yourself. Face down a serpent, cross the icy seas, win eternal glory, though realistically, you can barely manage to keep your toes attached until spring. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howls like a wolf, rattling the walls of the longhouse, but the thick timbers hold. That's the point, community. Alone, you would be frostbitten by now, just another nameless traveler swallowed by the cold. But here, packed together in this smoky, smelly hall, you're alive. It's almost comforting in a strange way. Safety doesn't always come wrapped in silk and perfume. Sometimes it comes in the form of overcrowding and questionable goat companionship. You glance upward, watching the smoke curl and fade into the rafters, and you wonder how people could endure this night after night, year after year. The truth is, they didn't just endure, they adapted. The Viking longhouse was an ecosystem, a place to eat, sleep, work, and survive together. It was noisy, chaotic, sometimes smelly, but it was also a shield against the endless winter pressing in outside. Historians may debate the exact layout, the spacing, whether livestock were permanent residents. But the consensus is clear. Without these communal spaces, entire communities would never have made it through winters that laughed in the face of human endurance. You pull your blanket tighter, letting the hum of voices blur into background noise. For now, you're safe. The cold is still out there, gnawing at the edges of the world, but you're wrapped in fur, half asleep by the fire. And though you wouldn't call it comfort, it's something close. And in the Viking world, something close to comfort was often the best you could hope for. You wake up the next morning, or what counts as morning here, though the sun barely peeks above the horizon, giving the world a dull, bluish twilight that never really feels like day. Your joints creak as you sit up, your breath forming clouds that drift lazily in front of your face, then disappear into the drafty roof beams above. The fire has burned down to embers, which you poke at reluctantly, wishing you had more wood without actually having to go outside and fetch it. This is the part of survival historians like to gloss over the fact that yes, Vikings were tough, but also they were probably just as cranky about crawling out of warm furs into freezing mornings as you are right now. Toughness doesn't make frostbite more fun. You slip on your stiff boots, the ones you left too close to the door so that they've frozen a little overnight. It's like cramming your feet into 2 buckets of ice, except less comfortable. And as you clomp toward the fire pit, the first order of business is getting that flame going again. No spark means no heat, and no heat means, you guessed it, your story ends right here. The trick is dried moss or lichen, maybe a bit of birch bark, things that catch quickly even when you're fumbling with numb fingers. You crouch down, blow gently, watch the smoke twist upward. Then, finally, a little crackle, a baby flame. You feed it patiently, coaxing it like a fragile pet, until you've got enough light and warmth to convince your muscles it's worth leaving the longhouse today. Outside, the wind greets you like a slap. You squint, eyes watering instantly in the bite of the cold. This is the sort of wind that sneaks under every seam of your clothing, finds every gap, and whispers, "Oh, you thought you were safe." Vikings knew the only real defense against this was layering. Linen tunic, under wool, under fur, under whatever else you could steal, trade, or hunt. Historians still argue whether the famed Viking horned helmets ever existed outside 19th century costume drawings. But one thing they agree on: hats mattered more than helmets most days. A warm hat could save your ears. A fancy helmet just made you look intimidating while freezing. You trudge toward the woodpile, which is buried under a stubborn crust of snow. Your breath comes in bursts. Your fingers tingle despite the mittens, and you start to wonder how many calories you burn just trying not to die in weather like this. A lot, actually. This is why diet mattered so much in the North. Not just eating enough, but eating dense. You chop at the ice-crusted logs, feeling the dull thud of the axe through the haft. Every swing is an argument between survival and exhaustion. Eventually, you manage to haul some wood back, adding to the small fire inside, grateful for the burst of warmth as the logs catch and spit sparks. The longhouse smells of smoke, wool, and damp straw. Around you, a couple of others are waking too, stretching, scratching, looking around with the resigned faces of people who know they'll spend the next hours just trying to maintain the basics. You're not farming right now. The ground is frozen solid. You're not sailing. The seas are iron plates under snow. You're simply keeping the roof from collapsing, the fire from dying, and your toes from turning black. This is winter survival, maintenance, not adventure. And in some ways, that's harder. Breakfast is whatever you can scrape together. Some sour bread baked weeks ago, hardened like a brick, but edible if you soak it in broth. Maybe some dried fish, leathery and salty enough to make you thirsty for water you'll have to melt from snow. You chew slowly, listening to the wind groaning through the rafters, thinking about how every calorie you eat now was bought by some sweaty harvest months ago. Storehouses mattered. Historians like to talk about raids and treasure, but the unglamorous truth: a successful Viking household was measured less by its silver hoard and more by how many sacks of dried peas and salted herring it could drag through February. Wrap yourself tighter in furs, glance toward the door, and debate whether today is a good day to check the animal pens. They don't exactly thrive in this weather either. Goats, sheep, even hardy animals need protection, straw bedding, food you ration carefully, because too much waste now means starvation later. You push outside again, squinting through the pale light, and stomp through the snowdrifts toward the rough wooden enclosure. A sheep eyes you balefully, its wool dusted with frost, as if to say, "Thanks for nothing." You toss in some feed, pat its back, and try not to think about how much warmer your own coat would be if it were made entirely of sheep. The day drags on in a kind of slow motion rhythm. Chop wood, feed animals, stoke fire, mend clothing with bone needles and coarse thread. Tell yourself jokes just to break the monotony, like, what's colder than a Viking winter? Your neighbors smile when you tell them you ate the last of the dried cod. You laugh quietly, though no one else seems amused, proving once again that humor is often just for your own sanity. In the afternoon, or what you assume is afternoon, since the sun never really climbs higher than the treetops, you hear the faint crunch of snow. A traveler approaching, maybe someone from a neighboring farmstead. You squint through the frost on the doorframe and see a figure bundled in furs, carrying a small sled with a couple of sealed barrels strapped on. Trade. That's the lifeline here, swapping what you've got too much of for what someone else has managed to preserve. Salted meat for grain, honey for wool. Even gossip is a form of trade, passed around like a luxury item to remind you that the world hasn't ended just because it feels like you're living on a frozen moon. Share a cup of weak ale. It's safer than water, and talk about who's managed to keep their livestock alive, who's lost a roof beam to the last storm, who saw a bear shambling across the fjord like a moving rug. Historians still argue whether bears were a common threat in Viking settlements, but either way, it makes a good fireside story, and you let the warmth of both the fire and the conversation seep into your bones. It's funny how in times like this, survival isn't just about calories and clothing. It's about community, too. A neighbor who shows up with a barrel of dried apples might be the reason you're alive come spring. As the visitor leaves, pulling the sled back into the white silence, you return inside and feel the tug of weariness. The day hasn't been dramatic. No raids, no discoveries, no sagas sung around the hearth. Just the relentless rhythm of chopping, hauling, mending, eating, and trying not to think about how many weeks of this still stretch ahead. But that's the secret the sagas leave out. The real story isn't the battles or the voyages. It's the ordinary people who kept the fire going, who made sure there was enough hay for the sheep, who woke every morning with cold toes and got up anyway. Evening comes in slowly, though it looks almost exactly like morning. You huddle closer to the fire, tucking your cloak around your shoulders, the flickering light making the shadows sway along the beams. Someone starts telling an old story, a saga about a hero who fought frost giants. The details change every time you hear it, and historians still argue whether such tales were originally meant as entertainment, teaching tools, or just excuses for bragging rights. But it doesn't matter. The rhythm of the voice, the crackle of the fire, the faint howl of the wind outside, it all blends together until your eyelids grow heavy, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. Stoke the fire, fetch the wood, feed the sheep, mend the clothes, trade what little you can, laugh at your own jokes, and remind yourself that even in the dead of winter, even at 40 below, you're still here. Not comfortable, not cozy, but alive. And that's enough for now. You sit by the edge of the fire, shoulders hunched against the biting cold, and stare at the shapes forming in the shadows. The flames crackle and snap, sending sparks upward into the smoky night air. and you realize once again how fragile this little circle of light feels. Beyond it lies nothing but darkness, frost, ice, and a cold so sharp it feels like it's gnawing at your bones. It's here, in this frozen void, that you're expected to guard the night. Not because you volunteered, of course, but because that's how the chores rotated. Someone has to stay awake, to keep the fire alive, to watch for trouble. Congratulations. Tonight, that unlucky someone is you. Your eyelids already feel heavy, but you know better than to give in. Close them for too long, and the fire dwindles, and with it goes the only thing standing between you and death by exposure. The others are counting on you, even if all they're doing right now is snoring, bundled up beneath layers of rough wool and animal hides. There's a kind of cruel irony in being surrounded by sleeping people who look almost comfortable while you sit here, teeth chattering, listening to your own breath mist in the air. You shift slightly on your makeshift stool, a log dragged close to the fire, and try to focus on the rhythm of sparks rising and fading, as though the fire itself were breathing along with you. It's easy to underestimate the sheer importance of fire, not just for warmth, though that's the obvious bit. Without this fire, you wouldn't have hot food, light to ward off whatever might be slinking about in the dark, or even a way to dry your boots after they've soaked through with slush. Historically, archaeologists often talk about Viking settlements being organized almost entirely around their hearths. The hearth wasn't just a fireplace, it was the beating heart of the longhouse. Every decision in building design came back to it. Where to place it, how to funnel the smoke upward, how to arrange benches and bedding around it, so as many people as possible could bask in its heat. Some scholars even argue that the hearth doubled as a social stage. People gathered around it for storytelling, games, gossip, or even negotiations. You might be tempted to imagine Vikings shouting battle cries all day. But honestly, a lot more of their lives were spent arguing over who got the best spot by the fire. But right now, sitting watch, you're less interested in history lessons and more focused on staying awake. The truth is, sleep deprivation feels like its own kind of torture. Your mind wanders in strange ways. One moment, you're absolutely certain you hear footsteps crunching through the snow just beyond the ring of light. The next, you're wondering if reindeer would make good pets and whether one could be trained to fetch sticks. You laugh quietly to yourself at that image, someone in full Viking gear tossing a stick, while a reindeer gallops after it like an oversized, antlered puppy. But then the laughter fades, and the silence creeps in again. Your job is simple: feed the fire. Every so often, you lean forward and place another chunk of wood onto the flames, watching it hiss and spit as it catches. The smell of resin wafts up, and you rub your hands together, relishing the brief burst of heat. Firewood doesn't exactly grow on trees. Well, okay, it does. But chopping and hauling it is such miserable work in sub-zero temperatures that every log feels precious. You think back to earlier in the day, when you'd hacked at frozen birch with numb fingers, each swing of the axe bouncing painfully before biting in. By the time you dragged the bundle back to camp, you felt like you carried half a forest. The fire in front of you is, in many ways, the reward for all that labor. It might surprise you, but Vikings weren't entirely reckless about their fuel supply. Historical accounts suggest they were deliberate in choosing wood types. Birch burned quickly. Pine gave a steady flame. Oak, when available, provided lasting embers perfect for banking overnight. Some researchers point out that driftwood was also common in coastal communities, especially when winters stretched long and inland forests were picked over. Of course, driftwood came with its own salty smell, and you can imagine the debates over whether it ruined the taste of stew or not. Historians still argue whether driftwood's mineral content actually made fires burn hotter, or if that's just a myth born from desperate sailors. And there it is again, the silence. You lean back slightly, adjusting your cloak, and try to listen past the crackle of the fire. Nights like this are deceptively quiet. The snow muffles everything, turning the world into a kind of soundless void. But every now and then, a gust of wind whistles through the gaps in your shelter, or you hear a distant crack, ice shifting, maybe a tree groaning under the weight of frost. Your imagination doesn't exactly help here. You've heard stories about wolves, though whether they'd really bother coming this close is anyone's guess. And then there are tales of worse things, spirits wandering the frozen wastes, or Draugr, the restless dead. You roll your eyes at the thought, but the truth is, when you're half asleep at a fire in the middle of the night, every snapping twig feels like a supernatural event. A long time passes, or maybe it doesn't. Time feels like it slips sideways in the dark. You think about the way ancient people didn't have neat ticking clocks to keep them grounded. For them, night watch was measured in how many logs you went through, how many times the stars circled overhead, how long before the horizon shifted from black to pale gray. You imagine Viking watchmen thousands of years ago, sitting exactly like you are, fighting the same exhaustion, trying not to slump forward into the flames. The thought almost comforts you. Almost. Then your head jerks forward, and you realize you actually did nod off for a moment. You curse under your breath, scrambling to poke the fire back into a healthy roar. You're not the first to struggle. Accounts suggest that watch rotation was a crucial part of survival in these communities. Everyone took turns fairness mattered, even if fairness was, in practice, miserable. You might picture tough warriors standing bravely under the stars, but in reality, someone was always half asleep, resentful, mumbling under their breath about wanting to trade shifts. One saga even hints at a feud breaking out because one man consistently shirked his watch duty. Imagine starting a blood feud, not over treasure or honor, but because you were too lazy to stay awake at the fire. Another log, another shower of sparks. You rub your eyes. A light joke to yourself. If only they'd invented coffee already. You wonder idly what Vikings would have thought of Starbucks. Probably not impressed with a pumpkin spice latte when all they wanted was something hot enough to thaw their faces. Instead, they had ale, mead, or occasionally hot broth, none of which are exactly designed to keep you sharp at 2 in the morning. Still, you think, a warm mug of broth sounds pretty nice right now. The fire is steady again. You lean closer, hands outstretched, feeling the familiar sting of heat on your skin. It's such a relief from the cold that you almost forget the rest of your body still feels frozen stiff. Your boots are near the fire, steaming faintly as the damp leather dries. You wiggle your toes, they're stiff, but they're there, which is something. Frostbite is no joke, and you know from whispered warnings that one bad night can mean losing fingers or toes forever. You flex your hands, making sure you can still feel them, and force yourself to stand up. Pace a few steps, stretch. The stars overhead are sharp tonight, brilliant against the blackness. You tilt your head back, trying to trace constellations. The Vikings were sailors, navigators, people who lived by the stars. Even inland, they would have known these patterns, used them for orientation, marked the seasons by their rise and fall. You try to imagine what they thought as they gazed at the same constellations you're seeing now. Did they find comfort in them? Did they feel small, staring up at endless points of light? Or did they feel powerful, knowing how to read them? Maybe a little of both. Your breath fogs as you sigh, returning to the fire. The night is dragging, your mind growing fuzzier with each passing minute. But you keep moving, keep poking the flames, keep reminding yourself that dawn will come eventually. You picture it, the first gray hint at the edge of the horizon, the others stirring, you collapsing into your bedding with the satisfaction of having survived another shift. That's what this night watch is, in the end, just a slow endurance test. Keep the fire alive, keep your body awake, keep the darkness at bay. And maybe, if you're lucky, slip in one more reindeer-fetched daydream to pass the time. You watch the long winter horizon shrink into a gray blur, snowflakes needling your eyes as you blink against the gusts. The night is drawing down like a heavy curtain, and your only shield against it is the thick hide you've draped over your shoulders. It's not glamorous. You're not walking into some mead hall with torches blazing and songs echoing. You're just trudging through silence that feels like it could swallow you whole. At times, the quiet is broken by the crack of ice beneath your boots, sharp enough to jolt you back to attention. This is the reality. The Viking world was not all about raiding, feasting, and horned helmets. Most of the time, it was a battle against boredom, cold, and the gnawing uncertainty of how you'll make it through the next week. You edge toward the rough shape of a longhouse, its outline dim under the drifting snow. The structure looks almost alive, like a slumbering beast hunkered down against the storm, smoke trailing faintly from the thatched roof. The door is a creaking slab of wood that doesn't so much open as reluctantly give way. And the instant you step inside, you're met with a rush of warm, smoky air. It smells of wood smoke, wet wool, and boiled cabbage, which, yes, sounds like a candle nobody asked for. But in this moment, it's paradise. The inside is dim, flickering with the uneven glow of oil lamps, the sort where a single flame sits in a small dish of fish oil and sputters every now and then. Shadows lean and sway across the wooden beams overhead, and for a moment, you just stand still, grateful that your face no longer feels like it's being sandblasted. The longhouse isn't quiet. Voices hum and murmur all around, rising and falling with the rhythm of conversation. Children scuttle underfoot, playing with carved wooden toys or bones that double as game pieces. Dogs circle lazily by the fire, waiting for scraps. And everywhere you look, people are doing something, because in winter, doing nothing is dangerous. Some sit repairing fishing nets, with fingers stiff from cold. Others sharpen knives on whetstones, and a few are working at looms. The steady clack-clack of wooden heddles echoing like a heartbeat. This is the Viking version of a winter evening. A house packed not just with people, but with activity. The longhouse itself, typically shared by extended families, is more than a shelter. It's a survival machine. Everything is arranged with intention. Animals huddle in one section, their warmth adding to the ambient temperature. Yes, you're basically living with cows as your central heating system, cozy, if not exactly fragrant. Sleeping benches line the sides, covered with furs and blankets, and the central hearth smolders constantly, tended by someone whose job is basically fire babysitter. You sink onto a bench, feeling the rough fur beneath you. Someone hands you a bowl of stew, broth thickened with barley, a few stringy carrots, maybe a shred of dried fish, or meat if you're lucky. It's bland, it's chewy, and it tastes like the best meal of your life. Nutrition, warmth, community, those are the three pillars here. If you've got them, you're rich. If you don't, well, historians still argue whether luck or preparation mattered more for Viking survival. But the truth is both were critical. Once the immediate needs are handled, fire, food, and a place to sit, you start noticing the softer details, the things that make a long night bearable. Someone plucks at a lyre, the sound wobbling but steady. Another person begins to recite a saga, weaving tales of gods, giants, and impossible journeys. You're not sure whether it's the warmth of the fire or the cadence of the voice, but your eyelids grow heavy. These stories are entertainment, but they're also glue, binding people together in shared memory and giving you something to carry into dreams. The storyteller pauses to sip from a wooden cup, and the quiet hum of the room grows more noticeable again. Somewhere near the far wall, someone is grinding dried fish into powder for later meals. Another person stirs a pot of curdling milk that might eventually become cheese. Yes, cheese. In the middle of all this, they're still experimenting with dairy products that may or may not taste like a failed science project. Practicality meets stubborn curiosity, and that stubbornness might just be the defining Viking trait. You notice that everyone has a task, even the children. A small boy picks at a piece of sinew, trying to twist it into thread, while his sister works at a spindle, carefully pulling wool into yarn. The rhythm of work is constant, because idle hands in winter are wasted hands. And though your mind might wander toward the thought of a Netflix binge under a blanket, you realize that here, distraction comes in the form of endless chores. At least if you're spinning wool, you're not thinking about whether the stored grain will last until spring. Somewhere nearby, an older man coughs deep and wet. You wince, because illness is as much an enemy as the cold. Winters in these cramped spaces are breeding grounds for disease. A cold can turn fatal, and a fever is enough to unsettle everyone. There are no antibiotics, no quick trips to a pharmacy. Instead, there's herbal knowledge, bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters, ready to be boiled into teas or crushed into poultices. Whether they work or not is sometimes up for debate, but at least it feels like doing something. And when survival feels uncertain, the act of doing something is almost as important as the result. The night outside deepens, the wind rattling the walls like an impatient guest. Inside, people settle more firmly into their places, pulling furs around shoulders, huddling closer to the fire. The sagas resume, and you catch fragments, Thor battling giants, Odin trading an eye for wisdom, Loki stirring trouble just because he can. You hear laughter in the pauses, gentle teasing over misremembered details, and you realize this isn't just entertainment. It's identity, it's culture. It's the way people remember who they are while everything outside threatens to erase them. At one point, the talk drifts toward practical matters. Someone grumbles about dwindling hay supplies for the animals. Another mentions the roof leaking in the far corner. Repairs can't wait for spring, not when a weakened roof could mean snow caving in. You see a few men and women nodding, already planning how they'll tackle it in the morning. Winter is constant triage. Fix this before it kills you. Fix that before it starves you. Keep everything in just enough order that you can see the thaw. And yet, in between all the tension, there's humor. A man with a beard that looks like it has its own ecosystem tells a joke about how he once tried to sleep closer to the animals for warmth, but was kicked awake by a cow. Another boasts about catching a fish so big that it got away twice, and though everyone groans, they smile too. You realize humor here isn't optional, it's survival. Without it, the nights would stretch endlessly, heavy as the snow outside. With it, even a miserable evening can become bearable. As the hours slide by, the room grows drowsier. Children drift to sleep, curled under furs, their breaths soft and steady. Dogs sigh and flop onto their sides. The crackle of the fire lulls you, and your own head starts to nod. Somewhere, someone is still talking, but the words blur into a hum, like background music you don't quite register anymore. You catch yourself wondering what spring will look like: green fields, fresh milk, long days filled with sunlight. The thought feels almost fantastical now, like a dream you might wake into. But for tonight, you're just grateful that the roof holds, the fire burns, and you're surrounded by others who share the burden. There's no heroism here, no glory, just the steady rhythm of human beings enduring together. And maybe that's the truest story of all. You shuffle through the snow with your boots crunching in that steady rhythm you're starting to find almost hypnotic. The air is sharp in your lungs, thin and biting, and every exhale makes a little cloud in front of your face, that quickly vanishes into the endless white. It feels like you've been walking forever, though in reality, it's probably just an hour or two since you left the last frozen camp. But when the world looks this flat, when the horizon is nothing but snow stitched to gray sky with a seam of wind, time stops making sense. You try to focus on the sound of your steps, because if you start thinking too much about how far you still have to go, you'll convince yourself you might not make it. Out here, the Vikings had no real maps in the way you think of them now. They had sagas and spoken directions, like sail for 2 days until you see the bird cliffs, then turn toward the setting sun. On land, they relied on landmarks, a particular twisted pine, or a rock outcrop shaped like a whale. The problem, of course, is that winter loves to erase landmarks. A snowstorm could wipe away the most recognizable path in a matter of minutes. That's why travelers often moved in groups. Alone, you're one bad turn away from getting lost forever. Together, you've at least got a chorus of arguments over which way is north. And maybe one of those voices will turn out to be right. Historians still argue whether Vikings carried primitive compasses made from iron needles floating in water or balanced on wood. Some claim a legendary sunstone crystal was used to locate the sun even on cloudy days, bending light to reveal its hidden position. Skeptics argue there's little proof, but as you stumble forward, you imagine how comforting it would feel to hold a glowing crystal in your hand, pointing you toward safety like some magical GPS. Instead, you've got your gut, and the vague sense that the wind has been blowing on your left cheek for too long. You pause and glance back. Your footprints are the only sign of life, marching away until the storm's haze swallows them. They look almost too delicate, as if the next gust will erase you from the world. It's a reminder of how fragile existence is out here. People who lived in these climates didn't talk about survival as something heroic. It was simply the baseline. Every single day was a negotiation with the environment. Do you have enough food? Can you get enough heat? Will the snow bury the doorway of your hut by morning? If you failed at even one of those, you were done. No medals, no sagas sung in your honor, just silence. You adjust your cloak tighter around your shoulders, remembering that these cloaks were often layered with fur at the edges. Wool underneath, fur on the outside. Not perfect insulation, but it traps heat surprisingly well. There's a reason wool has never gone out of style. It keeps warming even when damp. And dampness, as you're realizing with every breath, is the real enemy here. Cold air alone is survivable. Cold air plus wet clothing, and you're basically volunteering for hypothermia. The Vikings knew this, which is why they carefully oiled their boots with animal fat to keep water from seeping in. Some even stuffed dried grass inside the boots as extra insulation. A quirky detail, yes, but imagine standing here with soggy socks. You'd stuff hay in your shoes too. A raven swoops overhead, its wings stark against the sky. For a moment, you feel watched. Ravens had a special place in Viking thought, not just birds, but messengers. Odin himself was said to keep 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. who flew across the world to bring him news. When you see a raven out here, it could mean luck, an omen of nearby settlement or food, or it could mean nothing at all. Still, when you've been alone in the snow long enough, even a bird feels like company. You find yourself muttering hello under your breath, as if it might nod in reply. The ground shifts under your boots, snow hiding the unevenness of the terrain. You trip, catch yourself, and for a moment your heart thunders as you picture vanishing into some hidden crevasse. It's not impossible. Ice hides rivers, lakes, and sudden drops. One wrong step, and you could be beneath the crust, cold water closing over you before you have time to gasp. It's the kind of thought that makes you walk slower, carefully pressing each foot down before trusting it with your weight. Travelers often carried long poles, poking the ground ahead, as if interrogating the snow about what it's hiding. You wish you had one now, though you'd probably end up using it to swat at the raven just for the distraction. Your mind drifts to the question of supplies. Viking travelers packed light, but not stupid light. Dried fish, hard bread, maybe some cheese that's more salt than dairy by this point. You imagine pulling out a strip of dried cod and gnawing on it, the flavor salty and leathery. Not exactly a treat, but enough to keep you moving. They also carried drinking horns or wooden flasks, sometimes filled with water, other times with ale. Ale was safer than water in many cases, since frozen rivers weren't always trustworthy. A little alcohol probably also took the edge off nights like this, though too much would just leave you more vulnerable to the cold. You almost laugh thinking about it. A Viking stumbling through a blizzard, slurring about his bravery, before collapsing face first in the snow. Not exactly saga material. Your breath grows heavier, and the rhythm of walking settles into your bones. One foot, then the other. You start noticing small details you would have missed at first. The way the snow squeaks at a certain pitch when it's colder than usual, or how the flakes sting differently depending on the direction of the wind. There's a weird kind of meditation in it. Monks may have their chants, but out here your prayer is simply, left foot, right foot, don't stop. Maybe that's why sagas describe such long journeys with so little drama. The real battle isn't against dragons or enemies, it's against monotony. You just have to keep going. Ahead, you spot something dark jutting from the snow. Your heart jumps. It could be wood, maybe a marker left by other travelers. As you get closer, it resolves into a rough post, the top carved with shallow runes. Navigation markers like this weren't uncommon, especially near trade routes. Someone long before you decided this spot was worth noting, maybe warning of a river nearby or a path to follow. You trace the icy grooves of the carving with your glove, trying to imagine the hands that chiseled them. Did that traveler make it home? Or did their story end a few steps further on? Scholars argue about how widespread rune-carved waypoints were, since wood rarely survives centuries in these conditions, but the idea persists. And right now, you're grateful for the thought of company across time. The wind picks up, forcing you to lower your head. Snowflakes sting your cheeks like tiny shards. You think of how Vikings might wrap strips of cloth around their faces, leaving only a slit for the eyes, or even wear masks of fur in the deepest cold. Goggles made from bone or wood, with narrow slits, have been found among Arctic peoples, reducing snow blindness. Did Vikings borrow the same trick? It's debated. But when you squint into the white haze, you understand why such inventions existed. The world turns blinding, a glowing void, and you feel like you're walking not across land, but inside a cloud. You try humming to yourself, the tune barely audible over the wind. Songs kept people awake, and awake meant alive. You remember reading that travelers sometimes recited poems, not just for morale, but as a way of keeping pace. The steady meter matched footsteps, like an ancient metronome. Imagine trudging along with verses of the Edda bouncing around your skull, Odin and Thor keeping rhythm for your tired body. You attempt a few clumsy rhymes in your head, something about frost and toes, but your creativity sputters out quickly. Not every Viking was a skald, and tonight you're definitely not. The snow deepens, rising to your knees in some patches, and every step feels like dragging your legs through wet cement. You're sweating beneath your layers, which is dangerous in this climate. Too much sweat, and you'll freeze once you stop moving. The Vikings dealt with this by layering strategically, removing pieces as they worked, then putting them back on during rest. It's a balancing act, like adjusting the thermostat constantly. You imagine the absurdity of peeling off your fur cloak in the middle of a snowstorm because you're too warm. Still, overheating is a real risk, and it's one more reminder that the cold isn't just about freezing. It's about managing every tiny detail or paying the price later. Finally, through the swirling snow, you see the outline of trees. A forest. Relief trickles in. Trees mean shelter, maybe even firewood if you can gather it. The Vikings knew how to read landscapes this way. A line of trees could mean a river nearby, or game trails, or at the very least, a break from the endless exposure of open plains. You push toward them, the snow slightly less deep as the branches break the fall of flakes. For the first time in hours, the world feels smaller, contained by the trunks and branches. You lean against a tree, breath heaving, and close your eyes for a moment. But you know you can't stop for long. Travelers who paused too long sometimes never rose again. The snow was patient. It would cover you as gently as a blanket, smothering without malice. You think of the sagas that tell of heroes freezing mid-journey, their last words carried on the wind. Scholars debate whether those tales were exaggerated, turned into morality lessons about overconfidence. But standing here, swaying with exhaustion, you know exaggeration isn't necessary. The snow is story enough, and so you push on, deeper into the forest, one hand brushing the bark of each tree as if they're old friends guiding you forward. The sound of the wind softens, muffled by branches overhead. It feels almost like stepping indoors, though of course you're still outside. Still cold, still alone. But the rhythm of your feet continues. Left,